We often say that killers don't look like they're killers, or serial killers tend to look like your average guy. But what we really mean is that they look like a regular Joe or Jane who is kind of nerdy or shy, not someone who is handsome and charismatic. Well, meet Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy was handsome. He was charming. He was smart. And he was one of the most terrifying serial killers in American history. This is the story of Ted Bundy, a man whose smile masked a savage darkness. He was born Theodore Robert Bundy on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont. His biological father abandoned the family before Ted was born, leaving his mother, Eleanor Louise Coel, to fend for herself. She moved several times, taking Ted along, trying to make a life on her own. In June 1951, when Ted was 4 years old, his mother married a man named Johnny Culpepper, who she had known since high school. Johnny was an aspiring sports agent, and the newly formed family moved to Philadelphia. Sometime during this period, Ted's mother told him that his maternal grandfather and grandmother, who had raised him until she remarried, were actually his biological parents. She also told him that she was Ted's older sister. Why she did this remains a mystery. By all accounts, Ted had a pretty good childhood. He was active in Boy Scouts and excelled in school. After graduating from high school, he enrolled at the University of Utah, majoring in psychology. During his freshman year, Ted met and befriended a girl named Elizabeth Klepfer. Their relationship never became romantic, but Elizabeth did become close to Ted's girlfriend at the time, Carol Ann Boone, becoming sort of a trio. Later, Elizabeth would tell police that Carol Ann and Ted always seemed to be together, and she hadn't seen Ted without her for 3 years. So when Carol Ann disappeared in 1961, Elizabeth thought Ted might have something to do with it. But at the time, police didn't suspect foul play. Not long after Carol Ann disappeared, Ted's father, Johnny, died of a heart attack. According to Ted, his mother was devastated. However, others, including Elizabeth, thought that she was relieved. Ted graduated from the University of Utah in 1969 with honors and was accepted to the University of Washington School of Law. That same year, he began dating a woman named Susan Elaine Rancourt, who would later claim that Ted proposed to her. He wanted children, a house, and a wife. "I'd hit the jackpot," she said. "I could never imagine him being capable of anything violent or destructive." In 1971, Ted earned his master's degree in psychology. Around this time, he began attending meetings of the Seattle chapter of the Suicide Prevention Center, claiming he wanted to help people who were emotionally disturbed. Little did anyone know he'd soon be reaching out to them in another way. On September 14, 1974, a young woman named Anne Marie Burris left her apartment at the University of Washington to visit a friend. She was never seen again. A few days later, on September 16th, another young woman, Donna Manson, went missing. She had been at a local tavern playing darts and was planning to meet a friend at a restaurant, but she never showed up. Both women were 18 years old and both worked as waitresses. Police received reports that both women had been seen with a handsome young man who introduced himself as Ted, but Ted was nowhere to be found. Then, on October 13th, another young woman, 19-year-old Linda Ann Healy, vanished. Again, she had been at a tavern the night before and was expected at work, but never arrived. Once again, Ted was nowhere to be found. These cases would be among the first that police linked to Bundy, but they wouldn't find any physical evidence to connect him to the crimes for some time. What they did have was a handful of witness accounts, and they were eager to question Ted. Meanwhile, Ted was living his life in Seattle. He was working for the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Commission and had even managed to get himself appointed to the Washington State Criminal Justice Commission. One day in 1975, he got the opportunity to speak at the Utah State Legislature about crime prevention. When his name came up in the committee meeting, Ted knew exactly why he was being called to testify. He drove down to Salt Lake City, gave his testimony, and then took a leisurely drive back up to Seattle. But he would never get there. On December 12, 1975, while driving, Ted was spotted by a patrolman who pulled him over for a broken headlight. When the officer approached Ted's Volkswagen Beetle, he noticed a plaster cast on the dashboard. It looked like it might be part of a human arm. Ted explained that he'd found the sculpture in a parking lot and was returning it to its owner. That sounded odd to the cop, but he let Ted off with a warning. It would prove to be a costly mistake. After running the license plate on Ted's car, Police discovered it was registered to a Colorado woman who had been missing for quite some time. That was enough for them to dig deeper into Ted's background. They spoke to friends and acquaintances, who described him as a decent guy. No one thought he was capable of murder. But when the investigators asked if they knew Ted well enough to vouch for his whereabouts on certain dates, no one volunteered. Meanwhile, Ted continued his work, even giving an interview to Reader's Digest, in which he claimed that crime could be prevented by increasing educational opportunities for disadvantaged youth. All the while, authorities had reason to believe he was responsible for as many as 8 murders. Finally, on August 16, 1976, Ted was arrested and charged with kidnapping. When the charges were read to him, he responded by smiling and winking at the judge. He entered a plea of not guilty, but the case against him was strong. Police believed he was the killer they had been searching for, but they needed proof. In October 1976, Ted's trial began. He represented himself and conducted his defense in such a way that many people, including the judge and prosecutors, felt he was purposely trying to drag the proceedings out. He made motions to dismiss the charges and attempted to subpoena witnesses from as far away as Pennsylvania and Vermont. But his requests were denied and he was found guilty of kidnapping. In January 1977, he was sentenced to 15 years to life. He appealed the verdict, but in May, the appeal was rejected and he was transferred to the Utah State Prison. But Ted Bundy was not done fighting. In June 1977, he escaped. He managed to convince the prison psychologist that he had severe emotional problems and needed treatment at a mental hospital. While awaiting transfer, he walked out of the hospital and drove to Chicago. There, he hid out for a time, staying with an old friend from college before moving on to Aspen, Colorado. He was spotted several times and people reported him to the police, but each time officers let him go, thinking that whoever the real killer was, he was simply mimicking Bundy's appearance. One night in August, Ted wandered into a local bar, attracted by the familiar sight of a television set tuned to a news program. As he sat watching, he saw a news anchor talking about his own escape and urging anyone with information to contact the police. Ted watched, mesmerized, as they described him, knowing they were talking about himself. Meanwhile, searchers had finally located the bodies of several of the missing women. At a press conference, they announced that the killer was probably still at large, but they would continue to hunt him. Bundy wasn't worried. He wasn't captured that time, but it wouldn't be the last. After spending a few months in Colorado, Ted headed back to Washington State. There, he kidnapped another young woman. This time, however, he was recognized, and a witness wrote down his license plate number. With this new evidence, police were able to track Ted down once again. This time, though, Ted didn't go quietly. On February 15, 1978, he escaped from a courthouse restroom. Authorities put the entire city of Seattle on lockdown and sent everyone home, but Ted was nowhere to be found. 2 days later, he called the police department switchboard and asked if they had apprehended the man they were looking for. When he heard that they still hadn't, he laughed maniacally and hung up the phone. That same night, Ted drove to Florida. He landed in Tampa and checked into a local hotel. The next morning, he strolled around the beach, enjoying the sun and surf. That evening, he did something he had done many times before. He went out looking for a meal. At around 10 p.m., he entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. Using a crowbar, he smashed a glass pane and slipped inside. Approached a young woman sleeping in a nearby room and struck her on the head with a heavy flashlight. She screamed, but no one came to help. Bundy turned off the lights and fled. Within minutes, he was back at the house. He entered the room again and began stabbing the young woman. Meanwhile, other students in the house slept soundly. One girl awoke and screamed for help. By the time the police arrived, the girl's skull had been crushed. 2 other young women were seriously injured, but their lives would be spared. The story would not end there. 6 weeks later, Bundy kidnapped 12-year-old Kimberly Leach from a junior high school. She was never seen alive again. It was at this point that Bundy decided to give himself up. On February 15, 1978, he contacted the police and arranged to be picked up. He waived extradition and was taken back to Tallahassee. There, he was charged with 5 counts of murder. He defended himself during the trial, but he was convicted anyway and sentenced to death. From death row, Bundy gave interviews to numerous magazines and newspapers. He claimed to have killed 30 women, but the real number may have been much higher. He was executed by electrocution on January 24, 1989. As Bundy approached the electric chair, he flashed a peace sign to the crowd of reporters outside the prison. Some sources claim that Bundy mouthed the words, "Thank you," to the witnesses.
Oh.
Others insist those words were never spoken.